Good afternoon, Cliff. How are you today?
I am loving it. Yourself?
I'm doing awesome. It's good to see you here in our remote studio where we
Most
are
definitely.
recording the very first episode of the IoT Weekly podcast sponsored by GearForge Software. It's very exciting.
Woot woot. I agree.
So as this is our very first episode, I thought it would be great for us to maybe introduce ourselves a little bit. Cliff, do you want to go first?
Sure. I almost feel like I should be popping champagne, but I suppose you really can't do that remotely. It wouldn't have the same effect, would it?
Well, I don't have any here, so
Neither do I. Okay, so my name is Cliff Robbins. I'm a longtime lover of science fiction, technology, and I've got a really just a spot for sweets. My first program was essentially a hex editor for tweaking players and my favorite RPG.
And what RPG was that?
Gosh,
Cliff?
which one was that? Now you're going to date me here.
This is back in the day.
Yeah. It would have been probably the first World of Warcraft.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that would have been the first one.
Totally.
So that was tweaking my player, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. Why doesn't everybody else do this?
Yeah.
And then so eventually it kind of got into real type stuff to actually pay the bills.
Started making money.
Yeah. It's that necessary evil that you have to eventually do.
Yeah.
So I'd say probably my biggest thrill when it comes to whatever I do is really just tackling some tough problems and trying to figure out solutions. So IoT is full of problems right now. So there are a ton of things to have fun and solve. All right. How about you, Matthew? You want to do an introduction here?
I would love to. So I am a lifelong geek. I mean, if you're going to sum me up in 2 words, that's probably it. And D&D nerd going way back. I cut my first code at the keyboard of my Apple II Plus, which probably dates me quite a bit too.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, back in the day, AppleSoft Basic with the line numbers and all of that business on the green screen. Like that was my first memory of writing code, and I loved it. I just loved it. And I've really never met a programming language I didn't like, Cliff. Even Perl, people make fun
Seriously,
of Perl.
really Perl too?
Yeah, and it's such a powerful language. I can I can enjoy it even with its flaws. I'm a Linux geek. Pretty much, if I had my way, I would always be working on Linux. And most of the time, even my free time, I like building stuff that connects machines and people basically to the internet. That's sort of my thing.
Yeah, that's very true. I can attest to that.
Yes, and Cliff and I have worked together for a very long time doing exactly that, connecting stuff to the internet.
Yes, exactly.
Mobile devices, traditional computers, servers, IoT devices, you name it. We've connected it.
And each one of them has their own inherent kind of issues, I guess you'd say, along with that. And I always feel like you take one step forward and 3 or 4 steps back with this stuff.
Isn't that the truth?
It always seems that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this technology seems to go through these phases, and we're just, I think back, and it's 10 years now since the iPhone came out.
Oh my gosh.
Can you believe it?
No, actually.
I remember that. The Wild West of the mobile days.
Oh, entirely. And speed and all types of things. And yeah. How do we actually understand each device, all of that stuff?
That first Motorola Droid phone. Do you remember those commercials?
No.
Yeah, it's got the red eye and
oh yes,
back in the day.
Yes.
Droid. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, those were the days. But now we're looking to the future.
Yes, exactly.
So, Cliff, I thought it would be maybe a good idea. We should talk for just a minute about the mission of the show. Kind of why are we starting this podcast now, and what do we hope? What are our goals? What are we hoping to accomplish here?
Yeah, I think that's a great spot to start with regards to the podcast. I know I have some goals, and I'm sure you probably have different goals too. But personally, when I was trying to find information about IoT, I don't know, it just seems like it's so high level and nothing concrete, and it's just a big buzzword at this point. And I just really struggled, especially when I try to find anything when it comes back to a business perspective versus consumer, right? I mean, there's tons of stuff about echoes and everything else out there, but what about sensors and everything else from a business standpoint?
Yes, if you want Alexa to tell you a joke, there are, plenty of places you can go to figure that out. But if you're a business person and an entrepreneur and you want to maybe create something cool, that a device maybe that connects to the internet and does neat things, where do you even start, right?
Exactly. I mean, I don't need another fart app, right? So.
Does anybody really?
I know, but those are like the main ones that end up getting made first. That always cracks me up.
Yeah, it was back in the early days of the Apple App Store. A fart app was a good way to make $1 million.
I never understood that whatsoever.
That's not true anymore.
No.
Well, this is probably a good time to jump into a little bit of talk about our show's sponsor, GearForge Software. And Cliff, maybe to introduce this topic, let me ask you a question.
All right, go right ahead there, Matthew.
So let's say you're the entrepreneur and you've got a smashing good idea for that new IoT hotness that's going to revolutionize your business.
Well, I'd be pretty stoked about that. Tell me more.
Yeah, exactly. You would be stoked, but here's the thing. Let's say, now I know, Cliff, I know that you are an IoT geek, but let's say you're not. Let's say you're not a technical person. You're a business person, and you've got this great idea. How are you going to even figure out where to get started? Probably thinking through that, Matthew, I'd probably start looking at my personal connections and like, all right, what geek do I know to help me guide me in that direction? That's probably what I'd do first. Bingo. I wish I had a bell for a sound effect right now, because that, I think, is exactly what I would do too. And this is where the sponsor for our podcast comes into play. GearForge Software was really founded for this purpose, founded to focus on and develop Internet of Things technology and create custom IoT solutions. There's so many things to consider when you're trying to develop a new idea. You know this, having developed many new ideas, Cliff. There's so much. But in IoT, I think there's even more. You've got to think about, there's the hardware, there's the software. All this stuff has to connect to the cloud. And, if you're not a technical person, you might not even understand what is the cloud.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Yeah. And then, not to mention all those nasty hackers that want to try to tear into your data and steal all your secrets. Nasty hackers.
Dirty, dirty little guys, I tell you what.
What you need are some geeks. You need some techie advisors to help guide you through the Wild West of all this technology and the new digital frontier. And GearForge Software are those geek techie advisors that you're looking for. With 2 IoT labs, GearForge can bring your prototype to life and maybe just give you some good advice about how to even start thinking about the problems.
I can always use some good advice.
And Cliff, if people have that awesome idea and want to bring it to life, where can they learn more about GearForge?
Sure. I would stop by GearForgeSoftware.com. Again, that's GearForgeSoftware.com.
Awesome. Stop by and check it out. Support the show.
Definitely. Yes, thank you.
So, Cliff, you and I are both we're both geeks. We like to do technology for our day jobs, and then when we go home for the weekend, what do? Well, generally it's more technology. What have you been doing?
Well, probably the newest thing I did was I had heard about the AWS IoT buttons. Have you heard about those, Matthew?
I have. Yeah, they look really exciting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I ended up getting a little too excited and ordered about 20 of them.
I heard you ordered like 10,000. Is that
Yeah,
not true?
yeah. I way too many. I'll put it this way. When I should have gotten one. But I got a
It's
little
easy to get
excited.
excited about this
It
stuff.
is. I mean, come on, a programmable button. Why would you not get excited about that?
Exactly.
Oh, so that's what I ended up doing, and ended up getting a button, and that's what I played with all weekend long. And
So for our listeners who don't know, could you describe the AWS IoT button?
yep. So AWS, of course, stands for Amazon Web Services. So Amazon, a while back, came out with what are called dash buttons. And if you're not familiar with these, essentially you can take a button and have it order soap or toilet paper or I don't know, Cheetos if you want to. But you set the button next to those things, you push the button, and then voila! 2 days later, you got your Cheetos or toilet paper. It's pretty slick concept. Well, now they've taken that same concept and they've come out with a programmable button. So now you take the button and you have the option of programming a a double click, and a long press button. And so it actually connects up to your home Wi-Fi system. And when you press that, it sends a signal then up to the AWS cloud or the AWS IoT. And from there, you can do pretty much anything with whatever that is.
Yeah, and so this is taking this concept of the dash button, which, if you need to order some laundry detergent, that's really convenient, right? But now this kind of blows that wide open, right?
Oh, definitely.
Because you can use this button for really anything, and kind of just out of the box, right? You don't have to design and develop this thing. You can start putting it to use at home, or more importantly, in the business.
Yeah, and probably 15 minutes. I of course built my most useful app ever, and that was sending dirty text to my wife. So
oh yes.
So
did you get that idea from me?
Why would you not do that for like the first thing, right? Come on.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad you did. That wasn't the one that you sent to me. I woke up on Sunday morning to a text from. I thought it was actually spam at first, but it turned out to be Cliff's IoT button texting me some JSON, which was very exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of slick because it gives you, they say it's got about 2,000 button clicks, but the neat thing is it comes through with the JSON. It actually provides you with how much battery life is left.
Oh.
So you can essentially understand when they're going to be failed and when you need to change these things out.
Oh, that's fantastic.
The only bad part that I felt was it seemed a bit cumbersome to connect up to a home Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I really wish this thing would have come with a SIM and be able to just kind of use that and push through a SIM. So that way, I can't imagine having to walk into a consumer's home as a business and say, hey, I'm going to hook up to your Wi-Fi. Do you mind? And it just seems really odd to me.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something there. I mean, when I first was looking at this product, I sort of just assumed it had a cellular connection. But think of how cool that would be if it had a SIM card for a SIM spot for a SIM card, slot for a SIM card.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
you could just get a SIM card from a company like Ting.
Yep.
And that's really cheap and pay for what you use. And then as a business, I think that would be a really fantastic solution. And I think there are lots of maybe home uses for that kind of thing too. So I agree. Love that idea.
And this is version 2 of the button. I'd be shocked if it doesn't come out eventually. So I think my next thing I'm going to try to do is, of course, I just order more stuff. But Twilio has where you can get SIM cards. So, and it's by the actual number of transactions. So they've got a beta program for the IoT. So I just ordered 3. Of course, I'll give you one, Matthew, with a few buttons once they come in, and then I'm going to try to actually walk it through to see if I can't go through that route, create a kind of a mini Wi-Fi system right there.
I always like getting some IoT swag. So
I know. Oh, anytime.
That's awesome. So you mentioned the battery. It's got about 2,000 clicks,
Yep.
and you're referring to the battery life there.
Correct.
Yeah. And so is it a replaceable battery? Is it like a little button? What is it?
Really, when you look at it, it doesn't look like it's something you're going to be cracking open. From what I can see, it's more of a throwaway type scenario.
Gotcha.
And I think the other part too, which would be really nice with these, and maybe it hasn't, I'm not aware of it yet. Again, first time playing with these is, it's one thing to configure one, but if I've got 100 of these things that I need to configure, I think it'd be kind of painful to go through the process of configuring, let's say, even 50 of these darn buttons.
Yeah, it needs, probably before it can be super useful in maybe enterprise situations, you'd need some ability to administer these in batches.
Oh, of course, some way to provision these things.
Provisioning, yeah, exactly.
Would be pretty slick.
That's a good suggestion.
So, and that's just kind of gut feel. I'm going to be playing with this a lot more just to see what else we can do with this and kind of the limits and things of that sort.
We should see if Yvonne at Amazon could pass the word.
Oh yes, he would be a great person. I agree.
Yeah. So that sounds really exciting, and you know what else is really exciting?
What's that?
There is a conference coming up.
Ooh.
It is not in our area. We're actually located in the Midwest in Minnesota, where it is very cold today.
Extremely cold.
Here, coming up next week, November 29th and the 30th at the Santa Clara Convention Center, there is the IoT Tech Expo 2017. And this looks pretty exciting.
That sounds like a great time. Are there any IoT tracks specifically?
Yes, they have IoT, they have AI, and blockchain. I thought that was an interesting mix.
Interesting. What's blockchain?
So that's like Bitcoin.
And, seriously? With IoT and AI?
Yeah, so I thought that, I thought that was interesting. I mean, maybe on the new technologies, maybe that's where that's going.
Okay.
But yeah, blockchain is the technology behind that sort of makes Bitcoin possible. Sure. But there are a bunch of other uses for it as well, outside of like cryptocurrency.
Okay.
So there are some specific IoT tracks. There's developing for the IoT, IoT innovations and technologies, IoT in the enterprise, smart transportation and cities, data and security, and connected industry. And I want to go to all of those.
Do you know the one that I'm surprised they don't have in here, Matthew?
What is that?
Healthcare.
Oh, that is really true. And a lot of the news that I have heard about IoT over the last few weeks, almost all of it has been in healthcare.
Yep, 100%. I'm just really surprised I don't see something about medical devices or pure healthcare as far as efficiencies in hospitals. I'm just really surprised. I see industry because I hear a lot about kind of industrial revolution and things like that when I hear IoT. And then it's usually healthcare is the next big one.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually from our own experience, it seems to be something that our clients are interested in.
Yeah, exactly.
Good point. So I think this is interesting. Just, again, it sort of shows the emerging nature of this technology.
Yep.
We're starting to see some of the bigger conferences being put on, and man, there are just lots of events. If you look locally on Meetup or something like that, there are just lots of IoT things going on. I think this, in years past, this has been more a hobbyist area, and we're really seeing the transition now big time into interest from all industries. Big enterprise, it's going commercial, Cliff.
I totally agree, and I think there's still challenges whenever you jump from that hobbyist to big corporation or even small business. There's going back to your scenario, like, hey, where do you find that geek that can help out with this realistically?
Exactly. Well, and it looks like a good time at this Tech Expo. If you're in the area, many of these tracks are apparently free. You can check out the website to learn more about that. IoTTechExpo.com/North America. And check it out. Some of the tracks look like they require a paid pass, but if you're interested in this stuff, looks like there's some free options too.
And a side note, if IoT Tech Expo would like to send Matthew and I a ticket, we would love to come out to California.
It's so true. Yep. Absolutely. So, Cliff,
Mm-hmm.
we've been chattering here for a few minutes, and we have talked about IoT a lot, but we haven't really talked about what it is. And I think as a first episode here, it would probably be a good thing to try to get past the buzzword and just plain talk about what is IoT, why are people talking about it.
I think that's a great spot to start. It really provides us in a kind of a jumping off point then for future episodes, so we can talk through kind of industry news and things of that sort. And you've got a nice be able to say, hey, refer back to episode 1 where we talk through what is IoT, because every time I try to talk to someone about IoT, Matthew, it reminds me of the early days of mobile, and they'd be like, what?
Mhm.
What are you talking about?
What are you even talking about?
Yeah, that makes no sense to me. Why would that even be valuable? And when I do run across somebody, they're really thinking about Amazon Echo or Nest or something of that sort, where they're thinking about my fridge is going to order milk for me.
Right. Yeah, we've really just seen the tip of the iceberg here.
Yep. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
what is the big deal with IoT? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah. So I mean, if you start looking through just the research, right? They're saying by 2020, 2021, I mean, this is going to be a massive industry. They're saying that sensors alone are going to outpace essentially mobile device connections. And this is the same stuff before where we talked about mobile device saturation and things like that. It's like, all right, that sounds, again, pretty vague. But they're almost calling this like the fourth industrial revolution, essentially. And the reason for that is they're looking at it not so much from a consumer standpoint, but really being able to take the information provided from, let's say, a factory floor and really being able to do something for that. And the reason why it's taking off is because of the fact that these sensors and processing power is now, I wouldn't say super cheap, but compared to years past, the prices have dropped significantly for the capabilities that you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think cost and form factor are really a big thing here, and we should probably back up a couple of steps and just talk a little bit about. So IoT, obviously, it stands for Internet of Things. The internet's been around for a really long time. What's different now is that, in the beginning, you could connect to the internet with your desktop computer that you bought from Dell or Gateway, right?
Yep.
On a dial-up modem.
I had that too.
Yeah, I did too.
I used to play Red Alert with a friend of mine when I was in the Corps.
Oh, man, I loved Red Alert. we should totally resurrect that.
And do dial-up modem.
Yeah, well, I don't know about the dial-up modem, man. I could leave that behind, but Red Alert was a good game. So back in the day, it was you connect to the internet on a desktop computer, and then a laptop computer, and then along comes mobile, right? Mm-hmm. And that changes everything. Mobile totally changed the game, but basically you're still connecting on a computer. It's just a computer that you can hold in the palm of your hand. And so this IoT thing comes along, and really what we're talking about, I think, is that technology has gotten better and cheaper and faster and smaller over time. And so now you can buy a $5 board that will run a Linux, operating system. And you can connect it up to all sorts of stuff. You can connect it to your Wi-Fi and it can do things, right? And it's the size of a credit card. Yep. And you can get a microcontroller board and you can use that to power all kinds of things, and it's $10, And what the Internet of Things, to me, when I think of that, I think of devices basically with some brain to it. It's got something you can program, whereas in the old days you just had a circuit and it had a switch and it was on or off, right?
Yes.
And now it's actually got a computer running in it, and that computer is connecting to the internet.
Yep.
And that's the power of it, and that's also the sort of the danger of it, I guess, and why we often hear security mentioned in the same phrase as IoT.
And we should probably take a step back. And in some industries, we're essentially recording data and sending it through, but realistically, it was a very expensive, and they in many cases they were connecting up via satellite or something like that to send the data back, and those are called SCADA type systems, where they'd use PLCs and these massive cabinets where everything would come in as far as inputs and things like that, and you'd write ladder logic to connect everything up and then shoot it back to your SCADA system to track everything, and then you have these massive control panels. So a lot of the utility industries uses those, but I mean, again, they're very expensive, and it's not something the average individual or even the average company is ever going to deploy. It's not cost effective, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you think about the people you need in order to design and develop those things. I mean, you need a department with a bunch of engineers in it, right?
Yep.
It's not something you're going to do in your free time.
No, not at all. Not at all. No, it's not even open for that.
I think that was one of the changes here over the last few years is the rise of some of really they're hobby platforms, so to speak, but basically prototyping platforms. I think Arduino comes up a lot. Raspberry Pi comes up a lot.
What's Arduino?
So Arduino is basically a little circuit board, and it's got a microcontroller on it. And you can basically, if you're a programmer, you can write code that will run on that Arduino, and then you can connect that to virtually any electronic device and sort of give it instructions. What's interesting about that, I mean, there are lots and lots of things that's interesting, but that board was really targeted at sort of educational and hobby markets. But it makes an absolutely perfect prototyping platform. And that is the sort of thing that you used to have, a circuit designer basically build something for you, build a prototype for you. Whereas now you can use an Arduino board and it's off the shelf, right? And so you can do prototyping and you can develop all sorts of like devices, basically anything that requires electronics, right? Connection to something, servos, whatever. You can power it from an Arduino. Or potentially from a Raspberry Pi, depending on what you're trying to do. And it just blows open that door to prototyping, whereas before you needed the huge department, now you can do things kind of on the cheap.
So as you mentioned Raspberry Pi twice, we've got Thanksgiving right around the corner here. So is that a dessert that I'll be having in the holidays?
Cliff, I don't think anybody eats Raspberry Pi at Thanksgiving. I don't know if that's one of the traditional Thanksgiving pies.
Dang it.
But it's a great question. Raspberry Pi is another little circuit board. Basically, it's like a tiny little computer.
So when you say tiny, how big are we talking here, Matthew?
We're talking about like credit card sized and or slightly larger, depending on which version. This was another development that came out of really, I think, aiming at educational markets, trying to make electronics more accessible. And it has been picked up by the so-called maker community, people who do this stuff for fun, hobbyists, geeks like myself and you. We have, kind of all taken to this device because there are so many uses for it. But it also serves as this just amazing prototyping platform because you really can connect it up to just about anything if you want to, and puts it within reach of businesses or individuals to create cool stuff that even 10 years ago you would have had to pay, loads of money, big piles of money to get developed. Now you can prototype for a lot less, right?
Yeah, so you keep mentioning that's kind of a hobby type scenario. Do you think we've gotten past hobby with regards to Arduino, Raspberry Pi, things of that sort, Matthew?
Well, that's a great question. I think, there's definitely a big hobby, there's a big hobby community happening, people who are doing this stuff for fun and for little home automation projects, but it's definitely moved way beyond that. I mean, you've got the big companies building IoT devices, and they have been for years now, right? Google has gone into home automation, and you like GE makes light bulbs that you can connect to these things, and those kind of markets, right? But we're seeing, I think, even just from clients that we work with, I mean, we're seeing this need for IoT, even just prototyping, right, hitting mainstream in industry, and I think I see the signs all over the place. What about you?
Well, and I think I'm going to give an example and then come back around to something. Well, actually, I'll start with that first. So I think one of the interesting things I find is that now Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, they all now have cloud services specifically for IoT. So if you log into your back end of AWS, I mean, there's an IoT section inside of there, and you can easily go in there and play around. One of my new projects I want to play with is actually doing AWS Greengrass to a Raspberry Pi. So it's the concept you have. I'll save that for a later date, but it sounds pretty cool about being able to have sensors talk through it, do shadow copies and things like that. So, I mean, these large companies have made a bet that people are going to need to. You've got to put the data somewhere, and then you're going to have to be able to take that data and be able to turn that into something actionable, because otherwise it's fairly worthless. I think an interesting example is probably most recently the first IoT approved FDA pill.
Oh yeah, I saw this.
Yep. Did you hear about that, Matthew?
Yep, sure did.
Yeah. So they coat the pill in very specific metals, and once that hits your stomach acid, it actually provides an electrical signal. And then on your side, you actually wear a patch, and then it provides a Bluetooth signal up through to an app on your phone, and then from there, you can put in kind of how you're feeling and be able to push that up to the cloud. And I just thought that was remarkable, the first one. And this is a concrete example that's coming, and it's not. This isn't going to be the only pill. We're going to see more of these, I think, as it comes along.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I mean, we were talking about security. I also wonder about that kind of thing. You know, it's pretty weird to me to think about a pill that I have swallowed, you know, and a sensor that I'm wearing. Okay, so that's one piece, but then it's transmitting data via Bluetooth to a phone that's then transmitting data to the cloud.
Yeah,
that's there are a lot of
I'm trying to think
potential issues there.
Have you seen any sci-fi movies or anything like that with the pill that you swallow like that? I mean, besides like The Matrix, right?
Well, that's what popped into my head immediately. Yeah.
which color you taking? So
exactly. I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Yeah, because a lot of them are like brain interfaces, things like that,
Right.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of pill type scenarios. So this was really interesting to me when it came out, and I totally agree with the security, and you got so many different connection points where it could fail. Like, all right,
Yeah.
I mean, I think they said you got to wear the patch for like 7 days. It's got to be on your rib cage, and then you remove it, put a different one on. So,
well, yeah, and this is one of the pitfalls of sort of IoT, and one of the reasons why you've got to get geeks involved is, I mean, recently this year there was a pretty major security flaw in Bluetooth, right?
Yep.
And so in order to to patch that, you've got to make sure your software and your firmware is all up to date. And so one of the challenges with IoT is really, hey, so now, when you have a device that runs and it doesn't connect to anything, it doesn't matter, right? That flaw will never be a security concern because it doesn't talk to anything. But as soon as it starts talking to the internet, all of a sudden you've got a lot of surface area that can be exploited. And Bluetooth is one of those, surface area where there could be security issues. And how do you keep that? What's the process now as the patient? How do you keep that Bluetooth little sensor? Do they have to run updates on that? Like you have to run updates on your computer?
I don't know. I think they're throwaway patches, is my understanding. So it's like, all right,
far out.
Yeah, it is.
Just get the next one.
You get the next patch. Like, oh yeah, it's good.
Oh, this one's got a security flaw in the Bluetooth. You need to buy a new one.
Yep.
Basically, yeah.
So throw out all your patches, and you got to buy new ones.
Well, they're cheap enough. Maybe you could do that.
Possibly.
Yeah, I want to say one of the boards we prototype with has Bluetooth, and it's a $5 board. So
Yep.
yeah, you can get pretty cheap now.
Yeah, they're very, very inexpensive. Exactly. Huh.
So Cliff, so I get the scenario of people using sort of IoT and home automation stuff to turn the lights on, or to, you see those thermostats, like I think Nest is one of them that does sort of the intelligent managing of the temperature, and you save money over time because a computer can do that way better than a human can, using data, right? This is the sort of the power of this, is that now some machine can do stuff that we normally have to do for ourselves, and we don't have to think about it anymore. But I get that in home automation. What does that have to do with my business?
I think that's a great question, Matthew. And some folks, it's not going to, it has no impact on you. But for others, I think there's an opportunity, right? And I say that because I think we're still very new or still very young. But I think you and I were talking the other day about, I think you've got a scenario where you do business with a plumber, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Correctly?
Sure do.
And it's like, all right, in most cases, most folks are handing out these magnets. You put the magnet out there and you kind of say, all right, and this is a very rudimentary scenario. I don't even know if this will work or not, but let's say you've got the IoT, let's say just the AWS button, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of actually having to call the plumber, literally you could just press the button if there's an issue and keep it down in the basement, maybe where the plumbing stuff is, or if it's an HVAC or something like that. You hit the button, it automatically alerts them, you get a text message, and everybody's kind of aware about it, versus trying to say, all right, where's the phone number, going back upstairs, I've already forgotten about it because everything else going on in the life. And I think that's a very simple example. I think there's much more opportunity than just that, and I think those go back to even farming. So from a farming standpoint, if I know potentially, let's say the soil, how much water's in the soil and things like that, and I can leverage that then from a crop standpoint, I think that's a big deal, especially if it's real-time updates.
Yeah, the more data that you can collect with less human interaction, I mean, that can make a huge difference in a business.
Entirely.
And those scenarios, the people who are in that business are going to know what those scenarios are. Mm-hmm. You and I aren't necessarily going to know those.
No.
But there are tons of problems that could be solved through some of this, sensors and devices and things being able to connect up to a network. I mean, it seems like there's a huge opportunity, and we probably haven't even begun to understand all of those things. Creative people will come up with ideas by thinking about the things that could get done through automation, essentially.
Yeah, I had someone yesterday. No, yeah, it was yesterday. They'd mentioned like, hey, so I've got a machine. It's really difficult to essentially get electronics out to it, just because of wherever it is in the factory. And they're like, is there a way to essentially deploy? He's like, we can get a sensor on there to measure the bearing, so the bearing temperature.
Sure.
But he's like, we really struggle with getting a message back. And I was like, yeah, we could literally essentially hook that up and essentially a beam, right? Mm-hmm. Beam that back to the cloud, and then you can actually get some information about whether or not that bearing is going to fail. And that's a big deal to the factory, because once he understands from a heat standpoint of where it's at, they can actually do preventive maintenance then, so it doesn't go down during their cycle. They can actually take it offline on their own time and be able to manage it that way.
Well, and I mean, this,
and that was just from the business. That I had nothing to do with that. They're like, "Oh, could we do this?" I'm like, "Yeah,
absolutely." And think about opportunities. And I mean, I think about like inventory management. Long time ago, I needed to manage inventory, and you had to deal with that manually. Like I had a clipboard, right? You don't, I mean, I think now or in the near future, that won't be the case anymore. Everything will have a tag, right?
Yeah.
And it can inventory itself.
Boy, wouldn't that be slick? You walk through the door, yeah. It's like, oh, there we go. We just lost another one.
Yep, exactly. Inventory's done. Well, it's like Amazon's got that store, right? That it's like no cashiers, fully automated.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. It is, the opportunities I think are there. I think it'd be interesting to see what everybody starts making as this technology gets out there.
Yeah.
And it's probably also, worth noting that this is really still very new. I think we are at the very beginnings of finding sort of the business uses for
Yep.
this technology. And because of that, I think people are wondering where to turn. I mean, I think we see that in our business. Wouldn't you agree, Cliff?
I would totally agree. Most folks are just, because it's such an interesting, what I would say, interesting skill set, right? Because there's the electrical components you've got to deal with from a sensor and things like that, and all of a sudden you've got computers that are interfacing with that, and then you've got security concerns, and you've got to be able to talk to the cloud, and then turn that into actually reports. It's just a very broad aspect of skill sets that you need to be able to kind of handle through this.
Absolutely. And on top of that, it's all got to be secure.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And what we're seeing a lot of is sort of, it's a little bit lopsided. Either you've got you've got software people who need a device, or you've got hardware people who need software to connect it to the internet. And it requires that whole spectrum, right?
Well, and the projects we've looked at, every one of them has had some sort of security potential issue.
Well, isn't that the truth?
I mean, every single one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, I think that is just a big deal. We're going to be talking about that a lot, especially in future episodes as we go through the news. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity. There's also a lot of risk. And I think this is why people need, geeks basically involved in this process. And it's more than hardware.
I totally agree.
It's way more than hardware, just as your computer is way more than hardware. The same is true now for these devices.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's even beyond that is how do you deal with sensor failure, and there's a whole plethora of things that are going to come out of this yet.
Field servicing.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. What, do you take out a Mac, for God's sakes, or how do you do that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very interesting.
So let's say the people are interested. How do you start, Matthew?
Well, I think at this point, you start by finding a geek. What do you think?
I would agree. You've got to start somewhere, and I think just most folks, they're running into and this is based off of kind of chatting with folks and things like that. They're running into problems where literally they don't know where to turn at this point.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been seeing too. And, I think for all of the reasons we've already talked about, many times in these scenarios, the projects are at the, they could be at different stages, mm-hmm. but a lot of times they're at a very early stage. And at that point, there are just so many different directions you can go, and there's so many pieces that all need to fit together. And so a lot of times that's sort of the jumping off point is finding somebody who has some understanding of how to do this prototyping and help out with that plan, even just figuring out what the requirements are, right?
Well, and I think part of it too is since there is hardware involved, and let's say you get into the later stage of the project, you can't always dictate that they got to go back and change the hardware. That might not even be feasible.
Right, absolutely.
Because trying to set those type of requirements way down into the project, like that's not even possible. You're going to have to figure out a better way to go about this.
Yeah, and if you're a big company, you maybe have a department or two or many that does this stuff.
Yep.
It's the medium to the small companies that I think about, because those ideas are there, and you think about any situation where a computer might be able to automate something, and now extend that out. Mm-hmm. Past the realm of like desktops and phones. And I think that, there would just be so many ideas. But where do you even start if you don't have those departments of engineers to do prototyping? And I think that's what you got to do, is you got to find a geek.
Yeah, entirely. And then just start throwing out ideas and kind of brainstorming from there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Working with somebody and, really, one of the things that we see is when we see a project that lands, the requirements aren't formed at all yet, right? It's still just really an idea. And that's part of what we do, is help people figure out even what are the right requirements for this project, and then figure out next steps.
Entirely. All right. So, Matthew.
Yes.
So I think they've got a note of if you're interested, how do you get started? There's different components, of course, with all this stuff, and I think this might be probably a whole episode on its own. But even so, we've talked about Arduino and Raspberry Pi. That's kind of a straightforward scenario. But if I was going to try to select, let's say, a cloud provider, what do we suggest?
Yeah. Well, and this is another buzzword, right?
Yeah, of course.
Everybody's talking about the cloud.
Yep.
And I think, what we're really talking about is that those are the resources that really run on servers somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. That handle, when a device connects to something, it's got to connect to somewhere, right? So that's the Internet of Things. And there are lots of platforms. I mean, AWS, Azure has an IoT platform. There are some custom IoT platforms. But what's interesting is there are so many options. You can run servers, you can run serverless like Lambda, which is what you did with the IoT button, right?
That is. I created my own function inside of AWS from a Lambda standpoint and kind of ran it off of that.
Yeah, which I think it's really great. So, because Lambda, you only get charged for the milliseconds that you use, basically, unlike a server where you basically get charged all the time, right? For the server. But it's that kind of thing that, again, if you are not a technical person and you want to get started with something like this, I think the cloud, just that entire buzzword, can be a real stumbling block to understanding, right? And I think we use AWS for a lot of stuff. Basically, use AWS and DigitalOcean for almost all of our cloud infrastructure. Virtually everything. A little bit of extra stuff for email. But again, it's helpful to have somebody who knows what those options are and just can help walk through them, I think.
I would agree. I think the days of, and maybe you want to do this of your own, but trying to put your own server together for this in your basement, I think is going to be really tough. That's pretty compelling reasons to go with Azure or AWS or even Google. Auto detection of things and everything else. It's really a struggle, in my opinion, to kind of grow your own.
You definitely shouldn't put together your own server. That's really 2003.
Yep, I would agree.
Those days are gone.
I did that too. I put together a server, quite a few servers, and I've finally, how you end up just, I don't know about you, but you kind of collect electronics.
Afraid so.
And I was like, all right, it's time to get rid of the servers.
Yeah, and I mean, there aren't very many compelling reasons these days to run your own servers as a business. I mean, the cloud is just too compelling and too cost effective. It is so much freedom to be able to go on AWS or DigitalOcean, and I could spin up a server in literally seconds, and have something running on there, and then when I'm done with it, I could shut it down. It's a crazy amount of freedom, and looking back at where we came from, like those days in 2003, man, it's a breath of fresh air.
I would agree entirely. So I totally agree. I think cloud, we could probably have multiple programs talking through that.
Yeah, we should probably talk. Maybe talk about some of the resources that are there. Like AWS is huge. It's like huge. There's so much stuff there. And what's interesting is a lot. Depends on your application, but for IoT, there are going to be a lot of applications that produce a huge amount of data because of the number of devices or sensors or whatever. And your architecture has to reflect that, right? Using some of these cloud resources, I mean, they're built to handle that because they were really built to handle the kind of data that we saw in mobile when we were doing big time app development.
The thing I find that's going to be probably potentially problematic, and this goes back to kind of where things, it always tends to start this way, is as I'm seeing a lot of companies deploying creating their own cloud scenario where you got to keep everything in their realm. And I'm really curious again, it's going to be very tight, and then eventually they're going to open up and say, all right, here's an API, and now you can get to your data to be able to interface, because I just don't see that. Again, it's just like everything else. They start out a very closed system, and then you're going to have to open that up, because you're going to have to talk to this or talk to that, because the systems are going to need to talk to each other.
Yeah. These days, everything has to talk to each other.
Yeah. I'm just really surprised some of these are closing up and really forcing you into those scenarios.
Are you talking about like vendor lock-in? So there are some of these platforms.
For example, I was reading up on agriculture IoT, and some of the large tractor manufacturers. I mean, these things are massive, right? Mm-hmm. They've created their own.
Costs more than my house.
Oh, yes. But I think you get a free hat. So just
that's good. That makes up for it.
I think you get a free hat out of it. So that's. But yeah, I think they're creating their own closed systems, and my biggest concern is like, all right, that's great, but how do we get into those? And I would love to actually see if we can't connect up with some of those folks to get a better understanding of those systems and operability between them.
Yeah, and that's a great probably jumping off point. So what we're envisioning for future episodes, we're just starting. This is episode 1, so it's definitely in flux, and we would absolutely love to hear from you if there are things that you'd be interested in hearing on the podcast. You can get in touch with us at podcast@GearForgeSoftware.com. But what we're looking at doing news segments. There's lots of stuff going on. So this, we're thinking about it just a nice way to have a little bit of discussion and talk about some of the news that's happening in the IoT space. And also interviews, if we could line up some interviews with folks who are working on IoT, that would be great. If you or somebody might be interested in joining us for an interview on the podcast, we would love to hear from you. And again, you can reach us at podcast@GearForgeSoftware.com.
And a key note here, if you're interested in the interview, don't worry. You can literally do this from your office, because we're operating from a remote studio, so this works out great.
We try to do as much remote as we can.
Exactly.
So I think that just about wraps things up for this week.
I would agree, and hope everybody enjoyed the show, and look forward to future segments here around IoT.
Yes, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, thoughts, exciting news that you'd like us to cover, please get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you, and we'll see you next week. Hope everybody has a happy Thanksgiving.
Take care, everyone.